All rise. Okay, be seated now. Okay. Today we are in the day of court today. The state of Bloxburg versus Ruby Miller. Today we are here to hear the federal appeals of Ruby Miller. Ruby Miller was sentenced to death for the brutal murder and torture of 6-year-old Mackenzie Williams. Today I'd like to call the first witness up to the stand. Ruby's appellate attorney. She actually used to be a correctional officer at the women's prison that Ruby is incarcerated at, but she got a job. She ended up quitting that job, and she ended up going to law school, and she got selected to be an attorney. But she is here to represent and try to defend Ruby today. Today, she is going to try to convince us why we should let her live and why we should not execute her. Would you like to come up to the stand? I would. I absolutely would like to. I would love to do that. Okay, tell me your story, ma'am. Okay, so I'd like to tell you why I think Ruby should live. Ruby has some severe mental disorders. Ruby's had a rough childhood. That was never talked about in court. When I first went to prison to work there, I saw Ruby there. I knew Ruby was not in a good state of mind. I just decided to quit as a corrections officer because I knew for the fact that I didn't think it was fair that Ruby had to deal with that, and I didn't think that was fair. So I didn't think that Ruby should be on death row because despite what she did, there was not enough evidence to scientifically prove that she did commit the crime, but saying if she's guilty, she should not be executed because Ruby is mentally uncompliant. She's mentally impaired, which means she cannot stand trial. She's mentally unfit to stand trial. She's mentally not responsible. Ruby has ADHD, bipolar disorder, psychiatric disorder, and she also has a developmental disorder. Okay, well, give me a reason why you think that we should let Ruby live because of that. I get it's no excuse for what she did, but Ruby had several mental disorders. I was her teacher before when she was a child. I was her school teacher. Ruby had a lot of learning disabilities. Her parents abused her. I found out that Ruby actually had to be taken out of the home because her father was an alcoholic, and her father actually killed her mother when she was just a child, and her father also was an alcoholic. So Ruby's father ended up getting arrested for killing her mother, and he also was a drunk alcoholic. Ruby ended up having to get removed from the home. It's no excuse what she did, and I do feel very sorry. I have very remorse. I have lots of sympathy for the victim who was killed. I feel very bad for her family that they have to go through that. But I ask you, Judge, that you let Ruby live. She's mentally unfit to stand trial. She's mentally unfit, and therefore she should be ruled not responsible. I ask you, Judge, to commute her sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole, rather than executing her by lethal injection. 1, Ruby is mentally disabled. 2, Ruby has had an abusive childhood. And 3, Ruby did not plan the murder. She had anger, and she did it out of anger, but she didn't plan the murder. Those are the reasons why Ruby should not be executed. Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to get down from the stand now. Okay, thank you so much for your testimony. You may go sit back down now. I'd like to call the next witness up to the stand, the prosecutor. I'd like to call the prosecutor up to the stand, and she can go ahead and tell her story. You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Okay. Give me a reason why we should execute Ruby. Well, Ruby killed this girl in the most inhumane way. The girl was 6-year-old Mackenzie Williams. Mackenzie Williams was a nice young girl. She had everything. Her mother did neglect her, though, unfortunately. And as a parent should be just as responsible for their children as the perpetrator. If since Ruby's mother had something to do with this, and because she let her child run off, she's just as much as responsible as a parent would be as to the perpetrator. Okay. Also, I know for a fact that Ruby intended to do the crime because Ruby knew what she was doing, and Ruby did it out of spite, anger, and frustration. I get the crime was not premeditated, but in order to be eligible for the death penalty, this crime was brutal, and because the victim was under the age of 18, it was considered a minor. The murder does not have to be considered in the first degree. The murder does not have to be planned. Usually the crime is a capital case if the murder is planned, but it is not a capital, but you can be eligible for the death penalty if the crime was not planned. If the victim was a child, the murder was committed in a heinous way. The murder was committed for money. The murder was committed during robbery. Because the murder was committed, there are two reasons why Ruby is eligible for the death penalty. Because the murder was committed in a brutal way, in a savage death, in the worst way possible. And two, the victim was under the age of 18. The victim was a minor, only 6 years old. That is why Ruby is eligible for the death penalty. And that is why she should be held accountable. She deserves just as much mercy as she showed 6-year-old Mackenzie Williams. Thank you. Anything else you want to say? Well, despite her mental impairments, it doesn't matter what mental disorder she has, Ruby is just as much as accountable. Despite her mental disorder, Ruby knew what she was doing. If Ruby was mentally ill, that is no excuse for what she did. Clearly, Ruby can pay the bills. Clearly, Ruby had a job. Clearly, Ruby knew what she was doing. Ruby is mentally comparable to prove that she is responsible for this crime. Ruby is mentally contempt of this crime, and she is accountable. Ruby knew right from wrong what she did. She knew right from wrong. She knew better. She knew it was wrong. She did it anyway. Ruby snapped, and she did it out of anger. But because she kidnapped the child, because the crime was committed during a kidnapping, because the victim was under the age of 18, and because the murder was committed in a horrible death, Ruby is eligible for the death penalty, and she should be executed for her crime, and she should be held accountable. The sentence that was imposed should be carried out. We should not have to be waiting for at least 12 years to execute this monster. She should be executed right now. She's been on death row for 12 years. She should have been executed right away. She should have not until now. She should have already been executed. Justice ain't served. She's still alive. How is justice served for the victim when the murderer is still alive and we are spending our tax dollars to keep this inmate in prison every year? We're spending millions of dollars on tax. We're spending millions of dollars every year to keep this murderer alive. Justice ain't served. She is still alive. In order for justice to be served, the penalty must be carried out as it was imposed. The death penalty for her must be carried out immediately. She will be executed in order for the justice to be served. Ruby knew right from wrong, and she deserves just as much mercy as she showed the victim. Thank you, Your Honor. So I've heard both your testimonies. So today we are in the Court of Federal Appeals, the state of Bloxburg versus Ruby Miller. Okay, all of her state appeals by the state of Bloxburg have already failed. We are now on Ruby's federal appeal level. Ruby has spent almost 12 years on Bloxburg's death row. She's one of the 2 women on death row condemned to die. Ruby is eligible. If Ruby's federal appeal fails, she is eligible for an execution date. I will give her attorney one more chance to give us an explanation why we should not execute her. Your Honor. Thank you very much, Your Honor. I appreciate that, but I am here to try to provide an explanation why a person would come to do an act that was so violent. I get it is no excuse what she did. Ruby does deserve the death penalty, and I think she should be executed, and she does deserve to be executed. But I don't think she should be. Not saying that she's not guilty, but I'm saying Ruby has changed a lot on death row. She's become a really, really good person. She's shown remorse for it. She hasn't talked about the crime she has committed, but Ruby has shown remorse. She hasn't remorse for the victim being killed. Ruby is truly sorry for what she's done. She did not plan the crime. I get what she did was evil and it wasn't acceptable. And and it's still hard to explain why a person would come to do an act that is so violent. But I ask that you reconsider giving her a life in sentence without parole instead of death by lethal injection. Because Ruby is mentally ill, she's had an abusive childhood. She suffered from an alcoholic father. Her mother was murdered. She survived an abusive home. She's mentally unfit. I ask you, Judge, to recommute her sentence to life in prison without parole, rather than putting her to death by lethal injection. If she continues to live on death row, she will likely fail this federal appeal and likely be executed. I ask you, Judge, give her clemency. We could commute her sentence to life in prison without parole. I know what this person did was so violent and evil and wrong, but I ask you to reconsider her sentence to life in prison without parole. Thank you, Your Honor. But please let her live. Just please let this woman live. Please. Please let her live. Grant her clemency. This Ruby is truly sorry for what she's done, and she accepts full responsibility for her actions. Please let her live. Please. I would be so devastated if my client was going to be executed. Thank you, Your Honor. Okay. I've made my final decision. The state of Bloxburg versus Ruby Miller. I have heard testimonies from both the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney. Ruby's trial was messed up, and she did not have an attorney present at her trial. One of our corrections officers ended up having to quit just to defend Ruby. She has seen her. I get the trial had been messed up, and the trial had been flawed, partly, but it is still no excuse. Despite the trial being flawed, there is evidence showing that Ruby is accountable for the crime. Ruby's fingerprints were found on the chainsaw. Ruby was last seen with the victim. The victim was murdered in a brutal, cold, callous death by this Federal Court of Appeals. We deny the petition for clemency for Ruby Miller. As of what I've made my decision, what the prosecuting attorney says, I agree. Ruby knew right from wrong. She may have had mental disorder. She may have had a mental illness. She may have been survival of child abuse. But that is no excuse for what she did. Ruby clearly knew right from wrong. She could pay bills. She could drive a car. She clearly knew right from wrong. She knew what to do. Ruby knows what to do. She knows what she can do. She knows right from wrong. It doesn't matter what background she had. She knew right from wrong. I know, Your Honor, but I'm asking you that you please give her life in prison without parole because she did not premeditate it. Okay? But why should I? Can you provide me an explanation why she came to an act so violent? Ruby had mental disorder problems. She had several mental disorders. Her trial was flawed because there was no present attorney at the time at the trial because no one wanted to defend her. I guess no one wanted to defend her because no one wanted to defend her because she was considered so evil and violent that she was too much for people to defend her. But still, by law, by this court of law, everyone has a right to an attorney, even convicted murderers, serial killers, whoever they are. Bombers, shooters, that everyone has a right to an attorney. Ruby did not get that attorney. Her trial was all flawed and screwed up. I ask you, give her a new trial at least. I do agree that her trial was flawed, but Ruby clearly knew right from wrong. The evidence showed what she done. We are sorry, but we cannot help Ruby. It will be up to the governor now to decide if she can live or die. Weaver Court denied the federal final appeal of Ruby Miller. We've made our decision. Weaver Supreme Court, State of Bloxburg versus Ruby Miller. The federal court denies the final and last appeal of Ruby Miller. Because Ruby, despite the unfair circumstances that were never presented at trial, the evidence showed that Ruby knew right from wrong. She is just as much accountable as she would to be as any other person that would commit a crime. The victim was a child. The victim was killed in the most brutal, horrific way. The victim was kidnapped at the time of the crime, which makes her eligible for the death penalty. Ruby knew right from wrong, but she choked when the victim screamed for her to stop cutting her up with that chainsaw. Ruby could have stopped, but she continued to cut her up. The victim ended up dying of blood loss. The victim actually did not die of poisonous gas. The poisonous gas just knocked her out. After the victim was knocked out with the poisonous gas, but still alive but barely breathing, Ruby took a chainsaw, dragged her body out, and started cutting her up. The victim woke up, still alive, barely, screaming that Ruby would stop. Ruby continued to do it. The victim ended up dying of extreme cause of blood loss. The crime is too horrific to determine, but the body was cut up with a chainsaw and the body parts were disposed all over her backyard. That is enough evidence to show how much of a cold-blooded killer she really is. And her boyfriend does not even exist because there's no evidence to show who else was there at the time of the crime. The evidence we've seen shows how cold-blooded Ruby Miller is. The final appeal for Ruby Miller is denied. As a judge, Ruby is eligible for an execution date. We will be setting an execution date for Ruby Miller. Ruby Miller's execution date will be set to 30 days away. Ruby Miller's execution date will be set to be carried out in not less than 30 days and no more than 60 days. Between the day of May 1st and July 1st, Ruby will be executed during that time. The execution may not be carried out in less than 30 days and no more than 60 days. Between May 1st and July 1st, Ruby will be executed at the Padilla State Prison, and the sentence that was imposed will be carried out. Ruby will be executed by lethal injection at the Padilla State Prison. It will not be carried out in less than 30 days and no more than 60 days. This is the letter of the Federal Appeal Court. Thank you all. This case is adjourned.